Hello, everyone. Welcome to Onion Soup, the show where we pull back the layers of metaphysics and reality in order to demystify spirituality. And today we're going to do another solo episode because what I really want to talk about is the history of time. Now, I won't be talking about things such as the Anunnaki or Atlantis or Lemuria, things of that nature. Instead, what I'll be talking about is the most widely accepted history of time. And as far as time, the concept of time, and how has our concept of time evolved over the years. So let's get into it. I do have my notes today. And let's just get right into it. So, a brief history in time. So I want to start with before 5000 BCE. And before we even start there, let's get into what BCE stands for. So you have BCE, which is before Common Era. You have BC, which is most widely known as before Christ. You have AD, which is oftentimes known as after damnation, or in Latin, Anno Domini, which is the year of our Lord. So before 5000 BCE, we had civilizations and we had hominid humans on the earth, but people didn't really look at time the way that we view time now. Time was mostly looked at as in cycles, so day, night, seasons, and things of that nature. So we didn't really quantify time the way that we have it today. Time didn't start really being quantified until ancient civilizations. Ancient civilizations, we're looking at about 5000 BCE to 500 CE. So remember, BCE is before Common Era, and then CE would be Common Era. I didn't think I said CE a second ago. But CE and AD are oftentimes used interchangeably. Again, one of them being Anno Domini and the other one being Common Era. So between the years of 5000 BCE and 500 CE, we have the ancient eras. And one thing I want to point out about ancient civilization, anytime someone says that something is ancient, what we're really talking about is at least 1500 years old. So it has to be at least 1500 years old to be considered ancient. And the reason why that's kind of become the, let's say, standard of ancient is because we most often recognize ancient as the fall of Rome. And the fall of Rome was 476 CE. So, anyway, getting back into ancient civilizations and where time started, we want to start with Mesopotamia. And in Mesopotamia, around 3000 BC, that's when we first start getting a development of calendars. And the calendars were based on lunar and solar cycles. And here we find that time was a repeat of cyclical cycles representing patterns or following different patterns and divine intuitions. We also, around the same time, see the same thing happening in Egypt. And Egypt started to develop sundials and water clocks to mark the beginnings. And this marked the beginnings of what we would consider timekeeping. Now, with Egypt, time was most often associated with the afterlife and the ideas of eternity. And there were different deities that were in charge of death, afterlife, and time. And not just in Egypt, just like also in Greek, the Greek pantheon, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about the different pantheons and different gods on a different video. Furthermore, with ancient civilizations, we have ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, around 800 BCE, you get philosophers such as Zeno of Elea, and try not to butcher this word, uh, Heraclitus, who introduced the concept of time as fluid and changeable. And this is also where the idea of linear time emerges. So when we talk about linear time, we're getting into the idea of how we look at time currently and how we represent time. Time is oftentimes described as linear. So we'll dive a little bit more into that. Now, in Rome, around 753 BCE, we start getting the development of the 7-day week and 12-month calendar. And we start seeing a more standardization of time and time being used for more practical purposes such as law and administration in order to keep order with everyone that was involved within that particular society and within that particular civilization at the time. So then we move on to the Middle Ages. And for the Middle Ages, we're going to look more at 500 CE to 1500 CE. Now, with the Middle Ages, we start having religions that start incorporating time into their, I don't particularly want to say mythos, but let's say into their theology. Now, what I mean by that is take Christianity, for example. Time in Christianity is seen as linear, but it's leading to what's called the Judgment Day, or the Day of Judgment, and it focuses more on the future and attaining salvation before this particular Day of Judgment comes. So when we start looking at time from a religious perspective, it's in theological practices and religious practices such as Christianity and Islam is looking at it in the sense that in your physical life, there are certain things you need to do in order to achieve salvation or before you get to the other side. So there's a time limit there. So, like I said, in Islam, um, it's pretty much looked at the same way. It follows different cyclical patterns. And one thing that I find interesting, because I was talking to a friend about different calendars and everything. We started talking about the calendars in um, Islam and the Muslim culture, Muslim faith. And I found that there were a lot more holidays that seemed to follow the different seasons. Well, not just that they follow different seasons, because I don't want to say that Christianity doesn't have any holidays that follows the seasons, but it seems as if a lot of the Islamic holidays are more closely tied to the cycles and the seasons. But anyway, moving on. Next, we have the Mayans, and the Mayans were the first to really develop an extremely sophisticated calendar. Now, the Mayan calendar isn't something that's widely used anymore. Most people don't use that. People are mostly familiar with the Mayan calendar as far as 2012, and people were saying that because the Mayan calendar stopped, that we're going to have these major devastations that happened back in 2012. Well, what was really happening is that the Mayan calendar, just like any calendar, a calendar only goes up to the end of the year. So the Mayan calendar wasn't particularly a 12-month period. It was more for an astronomical year or a celestial year. So they had these different markers in their calendar saying that this event might occur, such as, let me rephrase that. It wasn't really saying that an event itself would occur. It was saying more so that the energies at a particular place and time, given what they knew about celestial bodies and astronomy at the time, could have an effect on the Earth. Now, when these different celestial energies or massive electromagnetic forces or possibly solar flares did take place, the Mayans knew about it and they marked it in their calendars. And then that's when you start seeing different forms of destruction and so on and so forth on the particular days that were marked in the calendar. So it was less about predicting that maybe a massive flood was going to happen and more about saying that we know that there's going to be a solar flare on Friday. And with this solar flare might come devastation. So that would be a more accurate representation about some of the things you might have heard about the Mayan calendar. And the reason why it ended was because that was just the end of that celestial period, end of that celestial year. And they just didn't make a calendar. The civilization was no longer in existence, by the time the celestial year was over, by the time where they would have created a new calendar. So also, with that, I did want to mention that their calendars were very interconnected with the natural world, which is why they were able to make such predictions. You know what I mean? So, moving on, we get to the Renaissance and Enlightenment period, which is between about 1500 CE and 1800 CE. Oops. So, in the this Renaissance and scientific Enlightenment period, we have the scientific revolution, which brings about time becoming more quantifiable and measurable through different advancements in clockmaking. This gives us the concept of absolute time and universal laws of physics. And I find absolute time to be really fascinating. And I'll talk about my own individual ideas on time, if time permits, at the end of the video. But when you look at absolute time, it's really describing an object at a particular location during space time, meaning that multiple objects can occupy the same space at the same time. And absolute time really defines this particular concept. And I'm hoping that I'm not losing many people or I'm not going stammering too much. But for instance, this cup, this mug, if I put the cup and mug on the table right now in this time, then nothing else can occupy that space in this particular time, in this particular moment. But obviously, if I move the cup to the side and then put something else right here, something else is occupying that space, but it's not occupying that same space at the time of the previous cup because there were other molecules right there. So that's kind of where we start talking about when we start being able to quantify time and start to measure it a little bit further. Now, with this, we start getting Isaac Newton, who really starts to bring about the idea of time being its own independent dimension, such as what I was saying before, giving rise to a particular item or um, a compilation of matter taking up a particular space at a particular time. And he starts separating time from space and matter as far as the dimensions are concerned. Now, being able to quantify time on a global perspective is what gave rise to us having these different time zones. So, as the world starts becoming more interconnected, we start to realize that if we look at a solar or lunar pattern or cycle, that's going to be different, giving different places on the localized celestial body of Earth. So, depending on where you are of Earth, obviously the sun is going to rise at one moment, and that moment is going to be different than someone else if they're on the eastern hemisphere. So, if you're on the west side, it's going to rise at one moment, and then if you're on the east, it's going to rise at a different moment. So, this gives rise to the idea and concept that there are probably different areas where the sun rises and sets. So, how do we standardize this? And you standardize this by creating zones and saying that, well, based off of this particular area, so what you do is you pick one spot and you use that as your determination piece or factor or point on where time is going to start and begin. Up until then, it's relative to the individual, which we'll get to on the, I think, the next slide actually, or next card. But up until then, it's just relative to the individual. So you have to have a point of focus before you can say that your time zone is 1 hour ahead of mine, or 2 hours, or 3 hours ahead of mine. And I didn't write this in the notes, but I should have. So this actually starts, if you ever wonder where time zone started, it's called Greenwich time. There's a place called Greenwich, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right. And I don't know when that exactly started. You'd think I would have looked that part up. It just came to mind. But Greenwich time is where quote unquote time starts. I'm just saying time starts as far as time zones. So when you look at the plus and minus on the time zone chart, it's originating from Greenwich time. So as we move on to the modern era, and modern era in this case is going to be 1800 CE to present time, we start looking at time as more theoretical with Einstein and his theories of relativity. And he starts talking about how time is no longer absolute, but relative to the observer and the gravitational field. And he starts speaking about the ideas of space time and how you can conceptualize that. Now, this goes back to, I'm not going to try to explain relativity in this particular video because, one, it's been a while since I read general relativity. And also, that would be a video unto itself. But when we say that time is relative to the individual, like I was saying a moment ago, it's more so the fact that we would perceive the precession and time change differently according to our location on Earth. And that would also change according to your distance to and from Earth, assuming that you are still measuring time in Earth means. What do I mean by that? So, say if you decide to get into a spaceship, or even if you're in a space station and you decide to leave Earth, well, if you were measuring time, you would still most likely measure time in terms of the Earth's rotation, not particularly your rotation around the sun anymore. Because if you start to measure time with your relative rotation around the sun, relative to the distance of the sun and the speed in which you are rotating, not counting for the speed of rotation of Earth because you're no longer on Earth, then it starts getting wonky and starts getting really complicated really quickly. So it's most advantageous for um, astronauts or anybody that's leaving Earth to continue to use Earth time. There's this article I had read a while ago, and it was this theoretical idea. It's less theoretical, more we just haven't practiced it because why would you? But anyway, it was talking about if you took two babies born at the same place at the same time, but then put one into a spaceship and sent it out into outer space and start to measure the rate in which those children age, one child would age faster than the other because one is on Earth and one is not, and one is affected by the gravitational pull and the speed in which Earth spins. Either other one is not. I don't particularly remember which one ages faster. I think the child that is um, outside of Earth ages faster. No, the child on Earth ages faster. I think the child that's no longer on Earth ages more slowly. I think the further away you get from the gravitational pull of Earth, the slower you age. But don't quote me. But moving on, I actually want to start talking about why we measure time in, it's called basic, but why we measure time in these increments of 5, 10, 15, 20, so on and so forth. Um, but mostly in a 60-ish, 30-degree range. Why is time, a whole unit of time rather, why is that 360 as we use pi to recognize time, ultimately, the circle? But the rest of our form of counting, such as currency and finances, it seems like a whole figure or a whole unit is 100. So like 100 pennies make $1, or $100 makes $100. You wouldn't say that a full unit of currency is $360. So why is a full unit of time 360 minutes or 360 seconds, or really 60 seconds, and so on and so forth? But I'll get into that in a moment. Right now, let's take a quick commercial break.
Open your mind and expand your consciousness. Welcome to Chakra Wonders, where style meets soul. Designed to uplift your energy and inspire your path to higher awareness. Every piece is a reflection of the cosmos and the power within you. Explore our collection and discover what resonates with your soul. Visit chakrawonders.com and step into conscious living. Chakra Wonders, conscious style for a conscious world.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. A moment ago, I was talking about, or we were talking about, time and why it is that we break it up in increments of 30 and 60. And when we look at finances, it's broken up in increments of 10. Well, the reasoning is that time utilizes a numerical scale called base 60, and our finances utilizes a numerical scale called base 10. Now, base 60 has its roots back in ancient Mesopotamia as well as ancient Samaria, where individuals were taught to use their thumbs actually as the pointer for counters. for counting. And the way that they did this was by, if you hold up your hand and you take your thumb as your counter finger, each individual digit counted as one. So that way you could count up to 12 on one hand. And what you'll find is that 12 is one of the fractal numbers divisible by 60. And ultimately, 5 sets of 12 would get you to 60. But when you start looking at different cycles, such as like the solar cycle or the lunar cycle, what you'll find is that the solar cycle is really close to one of the multiples of 60. It takes 365.25 days for the Earth to go around the sun. So if we split up the degrees into increments of 60, or if you split up a circle into degrees of 360, it kind of gets you pretty close to where we are with the astronomical cycles of the planet and the sun and things of that nature. Similarly, if you look at the lunar cycle is actually 29.53. I knew it was 29 something. 29.53 days, which is really close to 30. And then here we are again with this, you know, factor of 60. Now, the reason why we don't use base 60 the same way we use base 10 when it comes to finances is that base 60 actually gets kind of complicated to explain to others. And I'll be honest with you, I don't understand it 100% myself either. It makes sense to me mathematically, but when you start looking at astronomically, that's just not my area of expertise. So imagine being a merchant and back during ancient times, and you understand base 60 because you're a merchant, you deal with numbers all day, every day. But you want to go out and ultimately make your sale, or as a merchant, you are holding funds or finances for other people. This is where we get the forms of banking from, actually. How do you explain this counting system or number system to others in a very intuitive way? The most intuitive thing to do is how we count currently. You will use each full finger as a counting digit. You'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if you were to sit there and explain to someone that no, you could actually count this way, it gets really complicated for a lot of people, and it's really challenging to teach that um, to other customers, or teach it to different peasants and different serfs and stuff and things of that nature. So it just became more intuitive to teach base 10 to others. And we just kind of kept base 60 in our society because it seemed to be, at least from my understanding, it seemed to be one of the best ways to explain the precession of the equinox, the various astronomical aspects that were going on within our physical reality. Now, I did want to get into a few other things as far as, where numbers came from and how time can be relative in other aspects, but we don't have that much time left. So I do kind of want to give my thoughts and ideas. So when I think about time, I actually start to think about much about how time is a force unto itself, a dimension unto itself. But I think about time less as something that's fluid and more that's actually static. If you could actually imagine our physical reality, um, or maybe our world, so imagine Earth, the physical solid object that it is, and directly outside of that, a bubble. So each individual point on that bubble is a different time in a different place on that particular bubble. So there are infinitely many spots on any sphere. Now, the time in which you touch that spot on the sphere, that's what changes. So you can't imagine that you can't touch every spot on the sphere at the same moment, but every spot on that sphere does exist. So I imagine that time is similarly like that. So time is that bubble around the sphere that's ever present. It's always there. You just simply can't touch every spot at the same moment. You have to touch different spots in different places in time and different areas of the sphere, but it's always there. So I wouldn't say that time itself is changing. Our perspective is changing in the way that we flow through space, because as we flow through space and move through space as a physical object, that changes. And as we change locale, our perception is that time is changing. But ultimately, what's really happening is that we are moving from a physical position from X to Y, and or if you're going upwards, to Z, out into the the universe as it so were. But anyway, those are just kind of my thoughts on space time. And let me know what you think about this particular episode. I appreciate everybody for